It's a wondrous thing to get to work in the U.S. military. Sure, to each their own. The Army does its thing. The Marines, the Special Forces, and the Navy. I always wanted to be in the Air Force, but one part in particular. I was actually the gunnery sergeant aboard the AC-130U spooky gunship. See, all that wonder goes out the window when you've seen what I've seen. Those of you who do not know anything about the Spectre/Spooky family of fixed-wing gunships need a little background. Many people know about the C-130 Hercules cargo plane built by Lockheed, a turboprop plane that has been adapted for a lot of roles, mostly cargo. What makes Spooky special? Not too much, just the 25mm Gatling gun, 40mm Bofors cannon, and 105mm howitzer sticking out the port side, and the infrared computer targeting system. If you think that a fighter jet is an angel of death on the battlefield, the 130U is the angel that will fly in a circle about 7,000 feet over your head and blast the living shit out of you or anything unfortunate enough to be within a block of you. Being on the gunnery crew, my main job is to direct or fire the weapons, but my primary job was to fire the 105mm, the big gun. That baby has the firepower to level an area the size of a Walmart parking lot. The shells are so big that the aircraft can usually only carry 9 or a dozen at most. Why would anyone need that kind of killing power, you may ask? America. That's why. No, seriously, think of it this way. We have some of the most expensive equipment on the planet, and our style of fighting is tuned to invoke the most enemy casualties, while saving as many friends as possible. If that means using a missile that costs more than a nice car, or 100 of those cars, instead of putting friends in a firefight, that's fine. My job, my crew's job, is to make sure that as many of our buddies on the ground make it out alive. And as a bonus, we get to use the equivalent firepower of a naval destroyer, all on one plane. The American dream, or so it seemed, was to work on board that plane. I was saving American lives on the ground, firing from a mile away at enemies that had no clue we were there. All they could do was run, and they could only get as far as how long it takes to reload a cannon. But part of me wishes I had never signed up. I've seen too much now. Due to the nature of the operation, I can't tell you exactly where we were. Just know that it was likely where Bush had put so many of our boys in a war that didn't need to happen and certainly did not need to be ended the way it did. Place starts with an A. Shit went down in early 2000 AC. Do the math. It was not too long after 9/11s, and most of the personnel still had their fervor for revenge. We wanted to go in there and kick some sis. That was the Army's job, the Marines, and the Special Forces. I was seated up in a non-pressurized aircraft, sitting behind a gun that could knock God on his ass. To be honest, I don't remember where we were exactly, and it wasn't my job to know. All I needed to know was where the friendlies were and where to expect hostiles. A lot of people think we see things in all green. That's not how our night vision works. Military night vision puts everything in black and white, where hot bodies glow bright and white against the black, colder ground and buildings. It makes it hard to distinguish uniforms, which is why all our troops are tagged. So I watched as our boys got out of their HUMVEs and started their long walk. The main target, the area where the 2 Marine squads were storming, was this complex nestled at the base of these adobe-looking hills, pretty well camouflaged by brush and trees. It looked like a castle with a set of walls, a big gate, and several towering buildings overlooking the outside. I don't remember why the troops were going in there. In fact, according to what I could hear of their chatter, they weren't sure either. But none of us, at least those on hand, needed to worry. We were going in to take out targets. You may think that having this spooky overhead was a bit overkill, but like I explained, we were there to make it as easy for the Marines as we could. Everyone on board the craft was in direct contact with the teams below, and they were in contact with us via squad leaders. I could hear the jarheads talking about nothing in particular, just how this was another job, and how the hostiles inside did not stand a chance. Sitting behind the collective firepower of a squadron of tanks, I was apt to agree. I struck up a conversation with the first squad leader, a guy named Amos. "Having fun down there, Charlie 1. "Don't you know it, Spook? I'm approaching the target zone now." I heard other voices, random Marines. "It'd be just as easy to get them from here. Spooky's got the firepower to level the place, and we could all be home in time for lunch. You do know they're serving tacos again, right? It's Tuesday." "Yep. Well, maybe we can have some fun out here anyway. Get back in time for dessert." I could hear a few chuckles before Amos growled, all right, tape it up, guys." The Marines were coming within firing distance of the compound. I told the boys to be ready. As I zoomed in, I could see that everything was about to go down. Several glaring white forms showed up on the walls, filling in via doors and climbing up ladders. I saw them huddling behind ramparts, and each of them was armed. I called in to the leaders below to expect gunfire. You may ask, why didn't I light them up to kingdom come already? Rules of engagement, that's why. Simply put, you do not ever fire unless fired upon. It's how we tell friends from enemies and how we try to incur as few civilian casualties as we can. This goes for the Marines too, but I could see their bright forms spreading out, crouching their way towards the walls, ready to dash for cover. One of the defenders was waving his arms, seemingly gesturing to the ground forces, but I could not hear a word over a mile away. Over the comms, Amos was yelling in his native language. "Spook, they're screaming at us, but have made no effort to fire. They don't seem too hostile, actually." "I dunno, Sergeant. That's a lot of guns pointing at you." "What are they saying?" "Not sure. It's a bit far out to tell, but they're saying something to the effect that they want us to leave." I don't recall anything in the intel about having that option. "I know," I told them, "but he says that for our own safety, we need to go away." I could not see any of their guns being pointed at the Marines yet, but every single man was armed, a mix of Russian-made AK-74 assault rifles, G3s, some older 47s, and a few RPGs, but all of them were hiding, not yet aiming at the ground forces. They don't seem too hostile at the moment, but they're packing heat. "He's not backing down. He said this was our last chance. How's the view up there?" I took count of at least 30 gunmen, and more were climbing up, easily outnumbering the dozen Marines. 30 possible contacts. Get your boys down and ready. They look ready to dig in. No sooner had I said this that I immediately saw the flashes of white at the end of gun barrels all over the walls, but I could not hear the gunfire from over a mile away, so I called in to the Marines to confirm that they were under attack. I heard a clear confirmation from Amos. "Everyone, down. Spook, they're throwing everything they have at us. We are under fire." Repeat, "We are under fire." The gunfight was on, and all the safeties were off. The Marines were all lying prone, taking accurate shots and pegging enemies on the wall with precise accuracy, but they were heavily outgunned, and the somewhat inaccurate, constant small arms fire was getting too close for comfort. The Marines confirmed targets, and now it was our turn. I could hear the belching growl of the Gatling gun firing at nearly 4,000 rounds per minute, and could just see the white streaks like a swarm of bees falling on the enemy. The hail of lead tore them to pieces, knocking them off the walls like target dummies and tearing chunks of adobe from the walls. I could not help but stare when I saw more enemies charging up to their deaths. They were not going to retreat. God damn it, Spook, we got 2 tinkers coming out on top of us. I heard the call from Amos just in time to see 2 battered pickup trucks with hastily mounted machine guns peeling out the gate towards the boys on the ground. We call those technicals, and while they may not look like much, those Russian PK machine guns on the back are a deadly threat to infantry. Lucky for the Marines, we were able to respond with far beyond equal force. I authorized the use of the Bofors cannon, 2 rounds per truck. The gun boomed like a sledgehammer, and I saw the bigger streaks falling like lightning bolts. The first burst of 2 rounds, a double tap, hit the lead truck dead center, instantly turning it into a giant, white fireball of burning fuel and twisted steel. The other truck must have had a quick driver, as he swerved to avoid his obliterated buddy, causing him to just barely dodge the incoming shells. But to my surprise, he then kept driving towards the Marines. These insurgents were fighting to the death, and in that moment, I could only wonder if what they were protecting in the compound was worth it. A quick adjustment, and 2 more shells finished the truck off. The Spooky provided additional fire support with the 25 millimeters, but the Marines had most of the heat taken off of them. They made their way to the wall of the compound and through the gate that had been blown open by a hit from the Bofors. The friendly units were too close for comfort now. It was up to them to clear the compound, which they did with amazing speed. As ineffective as the militia were, they'd fought fiercely, and the Marines did not manage to take any of them prisoner. Our orbit now took us where I could see the largest building at the back of the compound, farthest from the gate. It was heavily defended with 2 mounted machine guns, but an earlier strike of Gatling fire had rendered them inoperative. What was strange about the building was the single door, a hulking thing built like a vault door. The gatehouse, as I call it, seemed to be just that, made to house a gate and keep people out. If I knew, then what I know now. The Marines found a switch to open the door. It slid sideways, and 1 squad went in. After that, I lost sight of them and kept in contact over the radio. Here's what I heard. How I wish I had not. Amos was breathing hard as his squad went in. "Spook, you should see what we got in here." "What do you see?" I was fed an image from his helmet camera, and I leaned towards the small monitor at my station. I had assumed that the building was some sort of garage, as it was not much bigger than a small hangar. But Amos's camera showed a long ramp leading down, underground. The tunnel was big enough to drive a tank through, and it was dark. We must have hit the power in the opening bombardment. Wow, they'd really dug in here. No shit. I think we'll lose communication once we're down there. The walls look pretty thick. Roger, Charlie 1, you're cleared to advance. The image cut out, and all I could do was settle back. Technically, by now the gunship's job was done, and we should have been flying back to base, but we had been given orders to remain on station, which was fine with me. Now I wish we had just flown home. My attention must have wandered because the next thing I remember was some Marine from Squad 1 screaming into my earpiece. He was panicked and out of breath. His voice was an octave or 2 higher than a Marine's voice should go. "Shit, shit. Spooky, do you read? Come in, damn it." I shook my head and tried to speak calmly. "Marine, what's going on? Where's your—" He cut me off like I had not even said anything. "Aren't you fucking listening? Use it." "Use what?" "The big fucking gun." My face must have gone pale. The Bofors gunner looked at me with widened eyes. I still tried to keep my cool. "Son, I'm not authorized to use the 105. What the hell do you want me to shoot at? Fuck your authorization. We're all going to die if you don't." His voice trailed off, and I could now make out noise in the background. His boots clopping on the floor, his heavy breath, and a loud crashing sound, like a semi-truck driving through a wall. No, 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 no. After I heard that sound, I felt all the blood run from my cheeks, like someone had thrown snow in my face. I can only describe it as a mix of a lot of ferocious beasts, and yet they all sound like mice compared to it. It was a roar mixed with a buzzsaw, and the shriek of a trapped cougar. I could just hear the last scream of the Marine before a loud racket made me throw my headset off. That awful noise when someone drops the microphone on the hard floor. I saw that everyone's face in the gunnery department had gone deathly white, but no one left their stations. I jammed my headgear back on and looked back down at the site. The Marines in Squad 2 had surrounded the massive gate and had their weapons out, but were slowly backing away. I listened in on their leader, a big black guy whose name I can never remember. Everyone, hold position, safety off, keep trying to get squad 1 on the... I heard everything go silent, and this hulking beast of a man let out a shrill gasp. What the fuck? How is that possible? He was trying hard to stay calm, but it was not the tone of his voice that scared me. I could see the massive door, built to withstand a tank blast, bulging outwards like a bubble about to pop, and whatever was pounding it was hitting the door with such force that I could hear it over the comms, like the deepened tolling of a distant bell. And then, as soon as it started, the bulging stopped, as did the thunderous pounding, and I could hear the squad leader trying to steady his confused voice. What the... His voice was cut off by static, as the door flew like a massive shuriken, immediately crushing 2 of the Marines. In my opinion, they were the lucky ones. After what I saw next, it must have been so hot. This massive, glowing white blur came rushing out of the now vacant doorway, almost as tall as the gatehouse. It was shaped like a boulder. It must have been nothing but muscle, like a horrifying hulk. All I could see of it was the outline that towered over the remaining 4 Marines. I heard their pitiful gunfire over the comms, but the thing was barely affected. I saw it backhand one of the Marines in one swing, smashing the elite soldier into a harmless bag of broken bones and crushed organs. It lunged forward, grabbing another, and with the Marine clenched in its gargantuan fist, it pounded a massive hole in the wall of a building and punched the ground several times. I did not see it drop a body. He must have been reduced to a pulp. The last 2 did not run, but to be fair, they barely had time to even turn. It came down on one of them like a mountain, crushing him under its fists, and it kept smashing. I saw it stop and slowly turn to the last poor Marine. I could barely make out his voice over his choked, tearful final gasp. Help me. It swooped down, grabbing him by the arms and legs, and with barely any effort, it ripped the Marine in half at the waist, like a child pulling the legs from an ant. It swung the bisected parts over its head and threw them to the ground. I must have done it on reflex. I could not feel my body. I could only guess how I looked, with my jaw hanging and my eyes so wide as to nearly pop from my skull. Before I realized what happened, my hand had clenched, and the aircraft shook with the sound of a clap of thunder right next to my ears. I saw the huge white blur of the 105mm shell streaking towards the target with pinpoint accuracy. It seemed to glide in slow motion, but in reality, even at this range, it only took 2 seconds. It struck the thing dead center. Everything in sight, the bodies, the buildings, vanished inside a small mushroom cloud of fire, dust, and shrapnel. I saw the nearest building collapse. The lower level blasted in on itself. A second later, I thought I heard the thump of the impact, but I could not hear anything else. I could not tell if my fellow gunners were screaming, muttering, or trying to get my attention. I could not hear the comforting drone of the 4 turboprop engines or the beeping of equipment. I did feel my heart pounding in my chest, like the thing's massive fist had pounded on that door, like the Marines' hearts must have pounded in their short lives. I barely reacted when I felt my commander's hand on my shoulder. He was as pale as the rest of us, and he was likely clenching my shoulder to steady his own trembling grip. As the dust and debris settled, I could see almost nothing was left. Nothing but a large bright mass, a thankfully still one, and a crumpled building. Surprisingly, I never got in trouble, but you can bet your ass I handed in my resignation and shipped home quicker than you can say, hell to the fucking no. Some things should not be seen. Some things should not be let out. I know that now. I saw 6 men die, and 6 more died on my watch. Yet all I was able to do was shit bricks at 7,000 feet. There ain't therapy for that kind of stuff. That's what PTSD really is. It's the human soul breaking at the seams pulled by stress that the soul was not made to be subjected to. Yes, I still have nightmares every now and then, but it's during the day when it's the worst. Know why? Because I think back to those last few seconds before I went to cry in the back of the plane. Those last few seconds of looking down that gun sight, those last few seconds, where I swear to this day that I saw that thing still moving. The memories from which I write and record in the diary are strained, at best. Frequent attempts by the doctors to convince me that what I experienced was surrealistic. The vivid appearances are only limited to the realm of dreams and fantasy. As they have attempted to convince me of this repeatedly, it strengthens my acceptance and understanding of what really happened. They contemplate, the doctors outside, what the best course of action is to proceed with after months of inconclusive results. The results are very conclusive, though. I did experience what I claimed. In case my memories are repressed and claimed away from my mind, I shall record them. I will start with what I remember. Only 6 months ago, I had been employed as a photographer and editor for 3 years. The wages were sufficient, if not satisfactory. I had lived in a quiet apartment on one of the higher floors, with rather large windows overlooking the city. Not quite a penthouse suite, but indeed of high establishment. The copies of our paper sold comparably to those of World War II propaganda only 50 years earlier. The people no longer want to hear the positive, exuberant expression of conservative ideals and the patriotism of the nation. They wish to hear the alternative ideals, those of Generation X and the coming millennials. My engagement this time around involved taking photographs of the recently restored chapel. The chapel, previously burned to the ground and left as a landmark in 1927, which had remained previously since the founding and creation of the city, was recently rebuilt and restored for use as a religious chapel. I myself am not religious, but this would be very significant in the eyes of the public. So I traveled to this chapel with my camera, ready to take photographs of the newly restored altar. The priests inside welcomed me. Inside, it was crowded, and I asked if I could come at a time when few people remained. They informed me that twilight would be the appropriate time to come for such photography, so I exited the premises and waited for nightfall. When I returned, the building was void of souls, save for a few of the clergy wandering the halls. It gave me the opportunity to photograph the rose window. The large halls of the building were lit well, but some kind of feeling, was off inside the building. I felt uncomfortable. The presence of an esoteric being is a strange, indescribable feeling. I did not want to remain here. I took photographs of the halls, and something came to mind. I felt the need to, before leaving, photograph the beautiful altar. Taking a look at it, I was amazed at the wonder of the altar. Flowers in vases decorated each side of the magnificent golden podium, with its pure white gold cross centered atop it. The cross was left. It survived the fire. A voice called from behind me. I turned to face the clergyman speaking to me. He spoke softly again. The chapel was not spiritual. It was a time when the church was focused on control and political power. They had incredible influence. A few members of the clergy died in the fire, but what truly died beforehand was the grace of Christ and God. Well, you did quite a remarkable job restoring this religious architecture. I trailed off. Yes, I suppose we did. He looked both ways before leaning toward me and whispering, "If you know what is good, you will leave as soon as you can. You will not return. There are things off with." A moment later, he trailed off, looking behind me and widening his eyes. He looked back, smiled at me, and turned his body, walking in the opposite direction. I didn't quite comprehend what he meant. It rang a bell in my head, though. I shouldn't spend any more time than I need at this place. I didn't want to remain. Thousands of voices both whispered and screamed in my head to leave, but I took the picture, the perfect picture of this altar. I regret doing so. I didn't bother reviewing the photographs I had taken. I didn't want to stay there any longer. I didn't see I hit a car in the middle of the road, and the photos, developing, hit the floor. One struck me in particular. In the photo of the altar, on the right, stood the faded image of a robed being, his face melting and his eyes falling out. The horror was greater than the approaching driver who opened my door and dragged me out of my car. His face immediately looked like what I had seen in the picture, and I screamed, bringing up my arms in defense as he bludgeoned me with his fists. Nearby pedestrians had come to my aid, dragging this man off of me. As I turned to face him, blood dripping from my nostrils, his face was normal, that of a middle-aged man. His stubble was trimmed but visible, his hair was slicked, and he was suited. I looked back at his car, a sporty black Mustang, virtually crushed in the front on impact with my SUV. He screamed obscenities, which I paid no heed to. I was more concerned with reviewing the photographs. I returned home with the camera and pictures in hand. I reviewed all the following photographs. In them all, there was nothing but this image of the altar. Why did I feel a need to photograph it? Why was it calling me? Was this what I had felt? What on earth was this? I studied it, looking at its haunting visage for hours in my house. Midnight had passed by the time I attributed it to a mere film error. Cameras often create film errors and distort photographs. This was all explainable. I walked into the kitchen to fix some wine. Chardonnay. I poured my glass and drank. I turned back to the photos, which had disappeared from the table. Panic arose. Someone is in my house. I quietly stepped into the dining room, looking for the photos. I needed to dismiss the panic. I'm just overthinking. Nobody could move that quickly to get rid of the photographs. I was right here. I should call the police. Instead, I took the wine and camera to my room and prepared the shower. Walking into the bathroom, I looked in the mirror for a moment before washing my hands and face in the sink. Before finishing and wiping my eyes, I looked back into the mirror, and I saw the visage of the hollow-eyed spook staring behind me. His hands were encircling mine. His mouth was bleeding and dripping, melting slowly like candle wax as it moved closer to my head and shoulders. I shook with violence and ran into my bedroom, and there on the bed were the photos, spread out in a pile. I turned my head to cover the room at a 360-degree angle, making sure nobody was there. I was dreaming. I was hallucinating. The Chardonnay. It was too old. It was only 1979. Only 11 years old. I ran out of the room and stepped on my couch, laying down and spending the whole night there, wide awake. I must have fallen asleep at some point, because I awoke with the photographs sitting on my coffee table, along with the camera. I was drunk. It was all a dream. I fixed the wine and set the photographs down. I watched television and fell asleep. The rest was a dream. I knew it was. I went to my bedroom to groom myself and get dressed. I showered with my shower gels and shampoo. I slicked back my black hair, combed it, shaved it, and applied deodorant. I dressed in a shirt and sport coat, but no tie. I put on my Klein silk pants and stepped into my black shoes. I was out the door, photos and camera in tow. Driving down the road, I saw a homeless man, bearded and gray-haired, in a dusty jacket. His card read, "The Godhead spilled his guts to birth humanity. His Holy Ghost haunts us." Before reading the rest, I was cut off by a bus driving past. I paid no attention to this. Rantings of a madman they were. I parked outside the building and walked into the office, presenting my photography to my fellow journalists and editors. The general consensus was that nobody wanted to write the boring story of how the church was rebuilt, and nobody wanted to read that, perhaps elaborating on the tragedies. Hesitation came with the feeling of presenting the photo of the spook to my editor. The latter, unknown feeling, possessed me and took me over, presenting the photo to him. "What is this?" he asked. When I reclaimed my senses, I had no idea what was going on. "The altar? Michael, I get it. But we need something solid, something haunting." "What?" I asked him, puzzled. "Go back and get me a story. Look up the history of the place." "What about the ghost?" I asked him, not even thinking for a moment about what I had just said. In fact, what on earth did I just say? What ghost? No ghost stories. Tragedy, maybe, but nothing tabloid. No aliens, either, Mike. He handed me the photograph of the altar. Clear, no film error, no hollow-eyed spook. What the? Go, Michael. Get. I trudged off. The photograph was clear. Nothing. I shuddered. There went a perfectly good. What am I thinking? I drove off to the library, browsing for history in the chapel. The librarian, a quiet, elderly woman, guided me over to a record of the church. Some strange things are done there. Evils. They played with sorcery, and when one man had enough, he lit the place. It was always ruled an accident, but our fathers and grandfathers know. They had awakened and invoked something terrible. Not a demon, but worse. They had altered their own souls. They had turned themselves into demons and ghosts, and so after the church burned, they committed suicide, too frightened by the images they had seen. I paused, frightened by her expressions. She whispered. The visions of their faces haunted the dreams of my mother until she could not tell the difference between a dream and reality. When I turned in horror at what she had just said, she had disappeared. I read up on the history of the building. It was a proud religious institution, a place of worship, something I wasn't quite so enamored with. I need to know more, though. The full story, I wasn't going to get it from reading city records. I needed to ask families, like the woman's. Information had to have been passed on. I knew that had to be the case. I needed to know more. I placed the book on the shelf, turned, and walked down the hall. Yet another book fell. One on necromancy and permanent astral projections. A voice inside my head told me to take the books. As I picked them up, the rest began to topple off the shelves. Hundreds of books fell off the metal shelves, pages ripping and ancient, historical books falling apart. They piled on the floors, and ink began to drip in puddles below them. As if the floor were tilted, the ink followed back, straight down the hall into a dark, black corridor, with a red less than exit greater than sign above. Out of the darkness stepped a black-robed, skeletal, wax-like foot. They dripped. The sleeves of the cloak dripped wax, and the hood draped over the face. It was pulled back, like magic, at an instant, revealing the melting face of the being. The ghoul turned directly towards me, looking straight into my eyes while I stared, at 12 meters away, into its black, empty sockets. As I looked into them, I saw indescribably atrocious things. Tortures, pain, suffering. I thought, Mother. I dropped the books. I ran down the hall and realized the only exit was the way the ghoul came. I turned back to look, and he was 3 meters away from me, slowly moving towards me. His feet were not stepping. Instead, he hovered, or phased, through the floor, as he would only be millimeters off the ground. The face draped down, and its mouth began to widen, dripping blood. Its black robe was exposed, revealing a white gown blood-stained by evisceration and lacerations. He moved, his eye sockets meeting my eyes. I froze in horror, closing my eyes several times, only getting closer each time. It occurred to me to run. I ran past him, and he made no effort to stop me. I picked up the books, and I looked back, watching him only turn to look at me and run down the exit. I reached the library lobby and ran out the door, getting into my car. I grabbed my camera and headed straight for the chapel. Pulling into the parking lot, I approached the door and was greeted by the same priest I met earlier. His eyes widened, and he spoke rashly. I told you to leave. You don't listen. What happened here 70 years ago? What really happened here? I asked him. Why? He responded. Because I took a picture of that altar, and since then I've been plagued by the ghost that you know very well. You are quick to assume things, he told me. Tell me, I demanded. Come inside. He opened the door for me and guided me inside. We walked down the halls, avoiding visitors and clergy, and walked into a private room. He sat down at the other end, and I took a seat in the luxury room. I sit in a leather chair. They practiced unholy things, he told me. My grandfather was convinced he could project his soul into the living world. Those books you found were his. Where did you get them? He nodded to the books in my bag. They fell off a shelf in the library. I tell them. They haunt you. He practiced the spells right on the altar. He projected his soul, but it appeared to be his human form. He could interact with his surroundings in this form, but he was immortal. He could do anything. He could. He hesitates for a moment. He couldn't drink, sleep, or eat in this form. He couldn't bleed or do anything. He couldn't urinate, but what he could do was prepare women for himself in his human form. My father was born at the height of my grandfather's practice. Eventually, he decided to take on his form permanently by dying on the altar. He would privilege the remaining clergy with this gift as well, and he locked them all inside. He set fire to the church, and in retaliation, they eviscerated him right on the altar. He did die on the altar, and my father told me that it was that moment where he whispered his spells. They tossed him right into the fire, and they cursed his soul to this place. When it burned down, there was no place for him to materialize. Until they rebuilt the church, my father fought against it for years, and when he recently passed away, they chose to rebuild it. You weren't the only one who was haunted. Several of my staff saw it. I asked. Wound up dead. He finished. They all died, under the strangest circumstances. What do we do? I asked. We burn the books and your photos, and we set the place alight. He told me. What? I respond with panic. It's the only way. You know it, and I know it. We go to the halls and lock the doors. There is one exit in the catacombs. I'll leave that to you. Let's go. My gut tells me to trust him and do this. The voice in my head tells me not to. I listen to my gut this time. He guides me to the catacombs. The door at the end leads into the sewers and the spillway. Lock it and return here. We will wait until nightfall for everyone to leave before I lock the entrances. Go. He guides me down the tunnel, opening the door. He lights a lantern for me, and I step into the darkness of the corridors. The voices inside my head. He lies. They lie. You will die this way. Step into the dark. Come this way. I came across some writing on the wall. Shining my light on it, it reads, In death, I am reborn. In the purge, I am free. The words terrify me. I trudge down the tunnel corridors, surrounded by stones and supports that survived the fire. A voice calls out. We were here for longer than you believe. The disembodied voice calls. It echoes. It nauseates me. I lived for centuries. I ran down the tunnels, not paying attention, and hit myself against the door at the end. I recover, standing at it. I could leave this behind. What if it follows? I could leave it behind. Leave it all behind. I lock the door and turn, my lantern revealing a silhouette, too far away to make out the features, but close enough to see the shadow. It limps towards me, closing in. I have nowhere to run. It falls to the ground, crawling towards me, breaking bones as it falls and gets back up. I take my camera and flash a picture. The visage of it terrifies me. The image of the ghoul flashed with the camera forever embedded in my mind. The gaping eye sockets, spiderweb-like hair, blood rushing from the mouth, the face melting, white clothing bloodied, and covered by black robes, maggots falling from its face, and its skeletal-like, rotting, gray feet. I try to run past it yet again, and it grabs my throat. Its eyes stare dead into mine. I see the colonist practicing on himself, shooting himself with a rifle, his blood and guts spraying out his head against the wall, and his spirit, bleeding in form, missing its jaw, leaving his body. I see the man in industrial New York doing the same thing, except this time, he disembowels himself, his intestines spilling out onto the floor, his guts falling out and splashing on the ground. I see all these men, restored in human forms, being executed along with their families. Accused of witchcraft, sorcery, and evil. Executed, lynched, murdered. I see a man being stabbed by his friends in his eyes and face, screaming that his soul will be locked in the burning church forever as he softly whispers the spells projecting his spirit. The fire comes down on top of him, lighting his face on fire and then killing him slowly. As he died, he cursed the clergy, the city, and the world, who sinned like him, but judged him even more rashly. His spirit form, disemboweled, and starting to burn, proceeds to chase them into fire, some of them stabbing themselves in fear or horror, committing suicide rather than facing the punishment of a wrathful spirit. It follows them, the ghastly, horrific burned visage, blackened flesh peeling off the white skeleton, the skin and flesh melting off the face. They go insane at the mere sight. When I reclaim my senses, I get back upstairs. The clergyman is impatiently waiting. It's already twilight. Where were you? Let's get this done, I tell him. He handed me a lighter. Do the honors, he asked. I light it. The fire gathers. Then he takes me aside and shoves me down, stabbing me in the abdomen and running to the final exit. What are you doing? I scream. Ensuring that the haunt doesn't follow you out, he yelled, running to the large door and locking it. No. I get back up, trying to reclaim balance. The pain was excruciating. My legs are useless. They won't stand. Trying to crawl towards the door, my sights turn to the altar. From it comes the ghoul. The hollow eyes, he walks down the pews, ignoring the fire. As minutes pass, he slowly comes towards me, his visage all but horrifying. His flesh finally peels and melts off, revealing the missing mouth. His robes and tunics fall off, revealing the disemboweled body and guts trailing across the floor. His eye sockets hollowed out, and he headed towards me but was not looking at me. Instead, he slowly phases through the door as the roof collapses around us. The fire didn't purge. It didn't lock him in. It released him. They cursed him. We didn't. They found me in the wreckage, paralyzed, screaming, and warning them about the ghost. It was from there that I found myself here, in this facility. I only heard recently that clergyman Mattox, in most unusual circumstances, cupped out his eyes and disemboweled himself. I write this to warn anyone that he is free. He is free and vengeful. His visage still haunts me. I know that one day he will come for me. My door opens, and out of the darkness come the eyes. Oh God, the eyes.